thank you so much. I love being a legend. Well, I'm really disoriented tonight. I came expecting that, well, I'll walk in, the room will be, maybe 60 or 100 people, and I'll get up on the stage and then talk for about an hour, and then that'll be it. But I'm so fired up listening to what's happened already, and by seeing the size of this audience, I'm thinking I should just throw out my speech and do something else. Two things I decided I definitely wanted to do. One is I want to move to this town. And the other thing that I noticed after John took a drink of that water, he gave such a fiery talk, I wanted to drink that. That was wonderful, John. I really appreciate your depth of the audience. I came with my money hat on to talk about the Federal Reserve System and money, but I'm going to take it off just for a few minutes because of you, John. I'm going to put my ideology hat on and my constitutional hat, because you triggered a couple of thoughts that I thought were so important. You were talking about the Constitution and how wonderful it was and how many unusual concepts were put into it for the first time in history. This was quite a rare document. It was the first time in history that a revolution had been fought, and the victorious side declined to simply declare themselves to be the new monarchy. I mean, that's the old style, right? You overthrow the king because you didn't like the king, because he didn't do what you liked, and he wasn't fair to your group, and so forth. You overthrew the king, and then you became the king. And it didn't take long because of the adage that we know that power corrupts. So if you're the king, now you've got the power, you become corrupted. And if you don't, by the way, the guy that comes along after you surely as heck will. So people have always focused on replacing people, replacing kings, monarchs, the bad guys, and they've never looked at the system. They always thought the system was okay, when in reality it has always been the system that was the problem and not the people. Because as long as the system has the ability to give human beings the power over other human beings, then that is going to corrupt human beings. It's as simple as that. And so our founding fathers came along and they got a hold of that concept, and they decided to change the system. Wow, what a thought. And so they wrote this thing we call the Constitution, which is, on one view, you can look at it and say it's a bunch of rules and regulations and directions of how to run a state. But if you really analyze it, it's a system of checks and balances, and as Jefferson called it, chains. You remember, after the Constitution had been written, Jefferson was engaged in correspondence with one of his friends, and his friend said, Mr. Jefferson, now that we have this new system in place, how can we be sure that only just men are elected to office? And those of you who remember this quote, remember Jefferson responded almost irately. He said, "Speak to me not of just men. Rather, let us bind men down with the chains of the Constitution." And in that simple statement, that political philosophy was the essence of our whole republic, to bind men down. He was saying, of course we're not going to have just men. Duh. Of course scoundrels are going to be attracted into bureaucratic positions, because as long as we give them the power to abuse other human beings under the protection of government, they're going to take advantage of that, of course. So we should not design a system that will ensure that only just men are elected to office. We must design a system that will assume that scoundrels will be elected to office, and design the system so that even the scoundrels cannot take away our liberty. It's as simple as that. As John pointed out so eloquently, this was kind of a radical departure in history, and it was a wonderful departure, and it worked for about 100 years. But now the reality creeps in. It didn't last, did it? It wasn't perfect. If it had been perfect in some way, or in all ways, why, we would still have the chains of the Constitution. But now we know, with this experience, that, well, actually the process started almost from the very first administration, the Washington administration. There were pressures and and opinions and movements within the newly formed government to begin to break those chains of the Constitution. And although it was very small in the beginning, with the passage of time, and especially with the passage of the generation that died off and forgot all of these concepts, had forgotten the spirit of the American Revolution, who'd forgotten the heavy weight of the rule from England, forgotten all those things, with new generations coming up and new prosperity, all of these things faded into history, and people forgot to take a look at those chains, and one by one they were broken, one link by another. And so today we have practically no links left in the Constitution. And so it's our job, it's our privilege, it is our duty to repair the chain. And I think that if we look at it that way, it becomes a very exhilarating challenge for us, because we can look at the Constitution, which in my view was a beta model. In history, I think maybe 100 years from now or 200 years from now, people will look back and say the American Constitution was a magnificent beta model. Now, with the experience of our era and the energy and the brain power and the consciousness of people like us, we will now design the second model, and we will build upon that experience and make it even better. Instead of lasting 100 years, maybe it'll last 500 years. And then it will probably fail too, because we won't see everything. But then at the end of the 500 years, there'll be a new group of people who say, aha, the model number 2 was better than model number 1, but it had some problems with it, so now we'll build model number 3, and that'll last for 5,000 years. And this is how the revolution continues. And that was I'd like to add just one little specific contribution to what I think will be an important addition to the second model. I think perhaps the greatest mistake that was made at the creation of our wonderful republic was because the Founding Fathers, understandably but accidentally, adopted the wrong word to describe the system they were creating. They used the word government. They said, what kind of government are we going to build here? And in the founding documents, you say it's government does this, government does that. Well, think about it. What is the proper function of government? By definition, it is to govern. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. That's a mistake. The Founding Fathers used the word government because that was the word that was in use at the time. That's what they always had. The world had governments. People were always governed by the state. And so they just adopted the word because that was it. But what they created was not a government at all. They created what I would suggest should have been called a protectorate. They created a state that was designed not to govern the people, but to protect the people, to protect their lives, liberty, and property, nothing more. And that's what they created.